like I've given you a rather strong billing there.
Very strong,
in terms of getting you. You have kind of had a bit of a scoop, and it
Yeah.
concerns what's on voters' minds,
Yes.
or what was on voters' minds as they cast their ballot next week. We'll do that a little bit later on with Luke Tryl from More in Common, who you've been working with on that one. Should we dive into the Conservative Party leadership contest? I was astonished last night, that exclusive by Stephen Swinford, our political editor, with Kemi Badenoch, so much briefing coming out. I mean, you know, we felt like we were in the room, and it felt like Kemi Badenoch absolutely lambasted not only Rishi Sunak but also some of her colleagues there. There were some very pointed remarks. That was in complete contrast to James Cleverly, who'd written for The Times about party unity. I mean, it all felt terribly constructed in sort of the way that the Conservative Party has been doing things recently, and that's contributed to their downfall. What did you make of what Kemi Badenoch said? And of course, her and Suella Braverman have been sort of slightly going at each other today, haven't they?
Yeah, so great scoop by Steve Swinford once again, and the strong suspicion was that the leak may well have come from someone close to Kemi Badenoch, because it didn't really show her in a bad light, given that she wants to appeal to the party membership. Basically, you know, she's criticising Rishi Sunak. I think a lot of members will agree with that. She was criticising Suella Braverman as well, which again, you know, won't maybe do her too much harm in the coming leadership election. But then she came out today on X and said that criticising the leak, basically trying to wash her hands off it, by saying, you know, that this is a time for unity and we should be able to have these discussions behind closed doors and not in public. So everyone kind of thought that was a little bit odd. And then Suella Braverman saw the opportunity to have a pop back at Kemi Badenoch. She took to Twitter and hit back and made a reference to a public breakdown, public nervous breakdown, because that is apparently what Kemi Badenoch accused her of having in the shadow cabinet meeting. So
yesterday. She's asking her to clarify the leak, basically.
Basically, yeah. But
we've not heard anything from Kemi Badenoch.
No, well, she is denying it. She's criticising the leaking of the comments, which is a lot of people are finding rather surprising, since she was the prime suspect for leaking them. But she says that it wasn't her. I
mean, some of our discussions have centred around the fact that actually it doesn't paint her in a brilliant light. Certainly, and it will depend how much her colleagues have to say in terms of this leadership contest and how it is conducted. Of course, it's up to the 1922 Committee of Backbench MPs for this specific selection process. We spoke to Bob Blackman, the new chair, last night, and he said the membership will be involved, but we don't know how. It could be that the membership are involved in coming up with a short list of sorts, and then the final selection comes down to Conservative Party MPs, in which case Kemi Badenoch could have really shot herself in the foot here.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a real turnaround from how it's been done. I think going back to William Hague's day, it's been MPs who whittle it down and then it goes to the membership. Now, I think there would be a real outcry were that to be changed. I was at the Popular Conservatism conference yesterday, which is those on the right of the party. So Suella Braverman was speaking at it from Washington. Jacob Rees-Mogg was there, one or two others, and they were saying, you know, the membership should have the final say on who should be.
But is that leader, because the membership prefers right-wing candidates?
Well, exactly. So, I mean, that's what we've seen historically, certainly.
Liz
Truss, Boris Johnson, when he was up against Jeremy Hunt, was obviously seen as the more right-wing candidate. And Rishi Sunak only got the job because no one else got enough support. So he was gifted it by acclaim, as was Theresa May back in 2017, of course. So
there's been a poll from YouGov for the party members project today. It found that Kemi Badenoch comes out on top with grassroots Tories.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at that. I mean, I think they like the cut of her jib. You know, part of her shtick is that she doesn't shy away from an argument. You know, we see that she's very pugnacious when she's on the TV.
She's very honest, actually, which as a journalist, even though it can be quite unnerving sometimes to see it, because it can feel quite sort of pointed.
She doesn't suffer fools gladly.
She doesn't suffer fools gladly, but actually I do respect her for never giving a politician's answer, really. She's always very, very direct and honest. And when that happens behind closed doors, shouldn't be leaked, but was. But obviously, she's maybe paying the price for that directness in that shadow cabinet meeting.
Yeah,
Or maybe will pay the price.
Well, perhaps, yeah. Although, as I say, it might even work to her benefit. I think the membership will certainly agree with her, but I think most of them will agree with her when it comes to Rishi Sunak. Her criticism of him, the decision to go early with the election without telling the cabinet. I mean, it takes some nerve to say that to his face, in the meeting. Not everyone would do that.
My kind of first reaction to it was Rishi Sunak there? Well, of course he was there.
Yeah.
But very, very direct. There's also the issue of how long this leadership contest should take. We saw a couple of opinions on yesterday's show. George Freeman said, well, 6 months, 9 months, it takes as long as it takes. Do we have the appetite for a long leadership contest? I mean, part of me thinks yes, it means that we're still very involved with the Conservatives. Do we get absorbed in that and not in holding Labour accountable?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I've spoken to MPs on both wings of the party, and there does seem to be a growing consensus that it should go long-ish, maybe up to Christmas, which does feel like a long way away. I mean, I guess the thinking is they're going to be in opposition for a long time. There's no need to rush into this. They've just taken the worst defeat ever. Maybe it's a good idea to thrash out, have a proper debate as to what type of party they want to be going forward, whether they want to be a one nation moderate party or whether they think that, the way to get back those reform voters is to tack further to the right, and they need to have that debate in the open, and that takes time and you can't rush it. I think Rishi Sunak would ideally like to leave sooner rather than later. I can understand it on a human level. He's just been through a grueling election period, a terrible defeat. How much can your ego take, really, when you're suddenly on the other side of the dispatch box asking the questions rather than answering
And there's
them?
been talk about an interim leader, about him sort of leaving at the end of the summer,
Yeah.
or there being an interim leader in place
Yeah.
when Parliament returns in September. Does that make sense to you, or again, is that just dragging it out a little bit too long? You've got someone else to kind of throw into the frame whilst you sort the other leadership out.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny enough, I spoke to one MP earlier who said that he thought that Rishi Sunak owed it to the party to hang around until a new leader is in place. He says, after what we've just been through, it's not too much to ask for him to hang on another 6 months. Because, I mean, you think about part of that will be recess. So there's, I think they put it to me that if I have maybe like 6 more Prime Minister's questions or something like that, that's not too bad, is it, really,
it's not.
for him to have to go
We know
through.
that he's hanging around as an MP.
He's hanging around as an
in his
MP,
constituency.
yeah, which is to his credit. So far anyway, it's still early days. I remember David Cameron said he was going to hang around after he stood down and he was gone as soon as he could. So let's maybe keep an eye on that one. But yeah, he was at the 1922 committee this afternoon.
Yes.
Rishi
What
Sunak.
happened? I was hearing about angry MPs in that meeting.
Yeah, well, certainly the ones that we spoke to outside. So he went in and there was the customary applause and banging on desks.
the
It was
table,
more
yeah.
muted, certainly, than previously, understandably, I reckon. But certainly the MPs that we spoke to when they came out said that publicly it wasn't that bad-tempered. People were reasonably kind to him. There wasn't any argy-bargy or anything like that. I think I'm told that he apologised again, took personal responsibility for it. He told him that he had spoken to, over the weekend, he had phoned just about all 175 former MPs who had lost their seats.
Wow, fair play.
Which I thought,
Yeah.
was the mark of the man, actually. He didn't have to do that. I thought it was quite a nice touch. And he also said that, the party needs to unite now. All the usual stuff, really. It has to unite, oppose the government, hold it to account, and also welcomed the new MPs and said, look, we've all got to get together now and start the fight back, really, back to government. But it could be a very long march indeed. Just
back onto leadership, there's a new JL Partners polling today on behalf of GB News, and they're talking about potential matchups here. And actually, Suella Braverman would beat each of her potential opponents in the final 2 contest put to Conservative members. So this is if Conservative members had the final say, the final 2, which is what's happened. What happened with Liz Truss, and this has Braverman outperforming her colleagues on every occasion. So probably the sort of headline of this is 35% Braverman, 32% Badenoch. Tugendhat level with Badenoch on 30%, which I find tough to believe. Braverman 37% against, Tugendhat at 31. So the overriding message there is you've got one poll showing Kemi Badenoch, you've got another poll showing Suella Braverman. Neither of those are moderates. And Suella Braverman's been discussing reform again and holding the door open to Nigel Farage. She's giving an interview this evening to GB News in which she's going to say, again, Nigel Farage should be welcomed into the Conservatives.
I mean, yeah, that is not a view that is held by most Conservative MPs. Very senior figures, they were saying it openly before the election that, this is a guy who has spent the last 20 years, 30 years opposing the Conservative Party, standing against the Conservative Party in numerous elections.
Did you see him yesterday speak in the House?
Yes. It was quite a moment, I mean, it was the 8th time of asking, and then he was in the House of Commons, and it was a typical Nigel Farage performance. He couldn't resist having a dig at John Bercow, which was quite funny.
It was a bit retro, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It brought flashbacks to the Brexit wars. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the Reform MPs adapt to Parliament, whether they can be the disruptors.
Is there any sniffiness in Parliament towards them? And we always caution on this show. We actually covered a lot of reform. We went to a rally and we completely appreciate, that there is a market for them.
Yeah.
There's also specifically a market amongst young voters for them as well. We know that now. And I just wonder how those Reform MPs are being considered by their colleagues. Is everyone collegiate? Is there a bit of sniffiness in the House, do you suspect, towards them?
I think there probably will be, at least initially. And I think they will do their best not to become sucked in by the Westminster system. They've gone there to disrupt it. They don't want to become part of the establishment that they're fighting against. So it will be. I mean, you go back to his speech yesterday. It was probably the only one, and there was a lot of them that was greeted almost with silence. Or there was a feeling that he'd maybe not caught the mood properly by using it to settle an old score with John Bercow. I think the feeling was that it wasn't the done thing. He didn't really. It wasn't the appropriate forum in which to do it, and it kind of fell a little bit flat. But that will be water off a duck's back to Nigel Farage. He won't give two hoots about that. He just wants to go there and cause trouble, and it's going to be fascinating to see the strategy that he deploys, particularly if the Conservatives end up with a moderate leader, someone who sets their face completely against them. But so has Kemi Badenoch has also said she does not want Nigel Farage anywhere near the Conservative Party. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that dynamic on the other side from the Labour government. Are the Conservatives going to spend a lot of their time at war with reform rather than actually taking the fight to Labour?
James Heapy stood down at the election last week. He has said fighting reform will see the Tories out of power for 10 or 15 years. In other words, it is a fruitless fight. They've got to go on and concentrate on their rebuild and what is next for them rather than concentrating on reform. Have you done any polling around the England game, by the way, just for larks?
Well, it's funny, we were doing throughout the campaign, as well as the two party leaders, we did a Gareth Southgate approval tracker. And if you think political leaders' approval goes up and down, let me tell you, Gareth Southgate's varies a whole lot more. So after the first game, it went up, it went down. After that rather dull second one, and is now back on the ascendancy. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was down again tomorrow if we don't win, or up even higher if we do.
Yes, predictable lot, aren't they? England football fans
Very
are just
fickle,
England
very
fans.
fickle.
Okay, let's talk about some research that you've been doing then into the issues that affected people who voted in the general election last week. One of the really interesting points here, in fact, tell us the question you asked first of all, and some headlines on the data, and then we'll sort of dig into it a little bit further.
Yeah, so we've been tracking throughout the campaign, and then immediately afterwards, when polls closed, the big issues that were affecting how people voted, that they decided on, basically. And it won't surprise you to know that top of the list was cost of living, and that has been consistent throughout the past couple of years, and was by far the biggest issue for people in making up their vote, followed by the NHS. Again, fairly unsurprising given some of the waiting lists that people are experiencing and struggles with getting a GP appointment. But then the really interesting thing is we broke down that top issues list by different types of voter. And for Labour and Liberal Democrat voters, who obviously powered Labour's victory and those Lib Dem gains, the number 3 issue was climate change and the environment, which we thought was really striking, given it basically hadn't featured during the campaign, during those debates. For those voters, it was the number 3 issue after cost of living and the NHS.
Really, really interesting.
And do you think, Luke, that this means that that Rishi Sunak maybe learnt the wrong lessons from the Uxbridge by-election, which the Conservatives obviously surprisingly won on the back of a campaign to oppose the expansion of ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone in London? He interpreted that as ordinary people resenting green policies. Do you think he misjudged basically how important climate and the environment still is to a lot of those voters who he desperately needed to win back?
Absolutely. One thing that is consistent through our research now is that climate has almost become a hygiene issue for voters, that they just expect a party to have a plan for climate transition. I think what happened in Uxbridge was that there was a misread of the fact that there were people who were disappointed with the way ULEZ was rolled out. We did lots of focus groups and people would say, well, there hasn't been enough time, there isn't enough support. I actually think if Sadiq Khan had brought forward all of the scrappage schemes earlier, you might have had a different result. But that was misinterpreted as an anti-climate sentiment and led to that rather strange set of U-turns in the autumn. And we actually asked voters as well about Rishi Sunak's top achievements and his biggest mistakes. And the interesting thing is that only 6% of the public put delaying climate targets in his top achievements, while 11%, so it's still not huge, but double those who said it was a big achievement, said that delaying climate targets was a mistake. So voters were more likely to view those delays in the autumn as a mistake. But I think aside from that, we would hear in focus groups things like, well, this means he's not really serious about climate change, does he? It's just another politician going back on their word. So it wasn't just that it hurt him on the specific issue of climate change. It was the fact that it reinforced in voters' minds this was a government which wasn't really delivering, had slightly lost its way, and pushing back or reneging on those climate targets was just another example of that for lots of voters.
I was surprised too. During the campaign, you pointed this out, and it's the case. I know that Labour's GB Energy did cut through. I hadn't realised that so many voters knew about it. That's what you experienced, Luke.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really interesting. It kept on coming up in focus groups as the one pledge that people had heard about and understood. And perhaps that's unsurprising when you think, at its heart, it was people thinking about their energy bills. But the really interesting thing, again, when you ask the poll question, is the breadth of that support on GB Energy. So over 70% of the public think it would be good for the country to have it there. But interestingly, it's a majority of Conservative voters and even Reform UK voters think that it's a good idea as well. And one thing I would just add to that, there's been some suggestion, I think, since the success of Reform. Does this mean we're going to see the sort of anti-climate backlash that we've seen on the continent when populist right parties succeed? When you poll Reform voters about why they voted for the party, 72% say immigration, just 4% say their policies on the environment. So it is really not a driver for Reform UK voters.
I wonder, Kevin, whether we're going to see more from Labour on climate sort of sooner than anticipated. If they understand that this is an issue for voters, this is one way to keep people who back them happy. Perhaps we'll start to see more climate policy, or we'll start to see Labour mention the green agenda and their investment in the green agenda, perhaps sooner than we were going to. I don't know.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, Ed Miliband will certainly be pushing for that. I mean, it is interesting, though, that they appear to have got away with rowing back themselves on a lot of their green energy. You know, they were going to spend, was it £28 billion a year?
That's down to what, 7 billion,
exactly.
9 billion, something
and
like
they
that.
seem to have avoided what Luke was talking about there, this impression among voters that you're all just the same, you just renege on your promises. So they've maybe dodged a bullet there.
Interesting. Luke, thank you so much for being with us. Hugely appreciated. You can pop your England shirt back on now.